Okay, welcome to another episode of Mr. K is Wrong, where I debunk the right wing Facebook posts of somebody that I used to know named Mr. K. I knew him back in my high school days, and he's full of crap, posts a lot of stupid stuff on Facebook. And today's episode is going to be about COVID and how no, it wasn't just an obedience test. So I'm going to debunk the right-wing Facebook post that he shared. It said, quote, COVID proved that most people will blindly follow authority, no matter how absurd the rules. That was the real experiment. So I'm going to offer my little rebuttal, and this is going to be a quick one. That's not what happened at all. COVID wasn't some obedience experiment. It was a public health crisis, and people followed rules for the same reason they buckle seatbelts or stop at red lights, because cooperation sometimes makes sense. It can even sometimes save lives. It's not always a bad thing. And I say this as somebody who has sort of a background in reading anarchist literature when I was younger. Now, granted, I never went too hardcore into reading anarchist material, but I'm somebody who definitely had an interest in rebellious, I said rebellious, but rebellious thoughts and ideas. So, if somebody like me can understand that sometimes, following the rules actually just makes sense, it shouldn't be that tricky for a lot of people out there to understand that, hey, sometimes, you do obey because that's just what is the smartest thing to do on occasion. Now, there are times for rebellion, but ironically, often during those very same times where rebellion makes sense, it's actually the right wingers who are urging everybody to be a conformist. And in fact, they urge people to conform even harder than they are currently. And I'm flabbergasted by the amount of things they will accept that are crappy and the amount of things that they will reject that are actually good. In this case, it's health and safety guidelines that actually are in accordance with common sense. And in other cases, it's what they will accept or actively encourage is obedience to basically police state measures, including the general concept that, hey, police should be able to get away with any type of abuse that they want. You know, that's a little bit worse to me than just following public health and safety guidelines. Like if you go to a store or a restaurant, they will usually have a sign saying no shirt, no shoes, no service. So, are we supposed to just throw out those rules too? Is that like some evil obedience test? Or do we normally wear a shirt when we're in a restaurant or in a gas station or something like that? Do we wash our hands, before we're working on somebody's food in a restaurant or something? Do we put in some basic safety standards when it comes to the workplace or manufacturing vehicles and things like that? Sometimes adhering to standards actually just makes sense because if even if it's not the government mandating it, sometimes you can have industrial standards that would make sense across the board. So even if we're not talking about the evil government cracking the whip and making people do things, sometimes it still makes sense to, do things that are expected because that is not just about conformity, but just common sense. Being in conformity with common sense, I guess. But anyway, not all rules are absurd. Masks reduce transmission, at least somewhat. Distancing perhaps lowers risk. and vaccines prevent hospitalization and deaths, at least in most occasions. And they'll try to get you on a technicality. They'll say that, well, you can still get COVID if you have the vaccine. Well, yeah, yeah, you know that, but it reduces the likelihood of you ending up in the hospital. And then another thing they'll say is that there are certain conditions that people might have that make vaccines harmful. And sure enough, if you dig, you can find that certain people have medical conditions that make any sort of treatment possibly dangerous. In fact, if you go into any surgery, you will probably be informed that there's going to be some risk with any type of surgery. And of course, if you look into things like aspirin or Tylenol, you'll find out that there are certain risks even with those types of things. Like there are people who die from, the common types of things like aspirin. So there's going to be a little bit of risk potentially for at least some segment of the population, but you still don't rule the medical treatment out entirely. And that's not even that nuanced of a take. It it's something that I used to think was common sense, but apparently there's nothing more in common than common sense. And certain measures were backed by decades of epidemiology and real-time data. That's why most countries use them and why they actually largely worked. Now they didn't work as well as some would hope. Well, I mean, at least in most places, there were a few countries where there were very few fatalities from COVID, however, and you might want to consider that as well. And in those cases, they really addressed the transmission early. They actually weren't goofing around, and they believed the science and all of that kind of stuff. So not everyone's blindly following things, either. In fact, the pandemic showed the opposite. You had widespread debate, protests, lawsuits, and constant pushback against authority. So, if anything, it revealed how difficult it is to get people to act collectively, even when the evidence is overwhelming that, hey, in some cases, people should largely act collectively. And there isn't always something wrong with that. It kind of depends on the context of the particular issue. In the case of pres- preventing, I almost said presenting, but preventing unnecessary death, then sometimes things like vaccines would make sense. And COVID didn't prove people are sheep. It proved that when the stakes are high, many people are willing to act responsibly, and some will reject even the most basic common sense measures if they clash with their ideology. And of course, the ideology in many cases was just people making up stupid stuff. Like, of course, you've got the claim that, if you take the vaccines, you'll end up with magnetic powers or something like that. I remember some people actually making that claim, and that the claims that it was actually more dangerous than the disease itself to have a vaccine. Just stuff like that was easily disproven. And I can say, as somebody who had booster shots, that they even had me and everybody else there who was to get the shots to stay there for about 15 minutes after getting those shots in order to make sure that there were no serious adverse medical conditions that or whatever you want to call them, scenarios that required hospitalization or anything like that. So they actually went out of their way to make sure that people, felt safe and that there were no, I guess, dangers. And I, I don't see how that could negatively reflect upon these places where I had the booster shots and the original shots. That's I suppose if you really bend the rules of reality, you might say, "Oh, see, they even knew the dangers. They knew it was dangerous, and then they gave you the shots anyway." But at the end of the day, it suggests they were safety conscious, and I think it's pretty cynical and, frankly, downright dangerous to suggest that all of these uh, people who are involved in this type of science are only out to like destroy people or and enslave them or otherwise manipulate or abuse them, when in fact they're actually doing a public service and they're helping to keep people relatively safe and disease free. They are actually saving some lives in some cases. So I think it's downright, you know, bad to portray all of those people as if they are outright villains of some kind. And that's one of the reasons the uh, the 2000 the whatever the 2020s are going to be seen as like a sign of some negative things that were on the horizon, because the paranoia that started to take shape and the disinformation and the erosion of trust in public services and just general public goodwill. I think that was, a very potentially depressing thing, and it's a sign of perhaps a societal decline. Anyway, that's it for this happy little episode, and have a good day.